My name is Scott Cate, and this is my good friend Dustin Campbell.
Hello.
And we are going to change your lives this morning. We're going to do that because we're going to make you faster, better coders, operators of Visual Studio. So how many of you use Visual Studio every day for your full-time job? Awesome. You're in the right place. How many of you were at TechEd last year and saw our talk? A couple of you, good. There's some things that we still have that are duplicates from last year, but it's like watching the same movie twice, your favorite movie, and you're like, oh, I didn't see that the first time around. There is a lot of new stuff as well, but some of those classics, we just got to make sure that we're getting into the heads of the newbie attendees. So a couple of things about this session. Our agenda for today is to fire hose tips and tricks at you as fast as possible. We probably have somewhere around 100 things to show you. There's keyboard shortcuts, there's debugging shortcuts, so we're going to get started as quickly as possible, but I want to focus your attention at the bottom. If you are a Twitter user and you're using our hash code, we will take a couple of questions and answers during the session. We actually have a Twitter moderator that's going to help us read those questions while we're doing the demos, and then we'll flip over. If you are not a Twitter user, there are mics in the aisles, and during the transitions, we'll try to take one or two questions if we can. But if you think about this session, we really want to get as much information to you as possible. So we are going to take a few questions, but not a lot. I don't want to have you frustrated if you're standing at the mic. If you're 4 or 5 deep at the mic, we're not going to get to your question. Either hang around afterwards and talk to us one-on-one, or send it out on Twitter, and then if it's appropriate, we can get it up on the screen for you. So TE for TechEd, and our session title is Dev 305. So we want to get the most out of Visual Studio, better, faster, code tricks, fun facts, blah, blah, blah. And we've done a little bit of math that if you can save a couple of seconds on every trick that we show you, that saves about a day a year of coding. And depending on your career, you might be able to just retire now based on all of the time savings we have for you. This is my friend Dustin. He's wearing a special shirt for you today.
This is the heart and soul of every Microsoft employee right here. I just want to reveal that to you. But I am here to help you guys. So like you said, if we want to talk one-on-one later, if you have questions or other questions about things that we didn't show, feel free to ask us throughout the conference as well.
If you can't see, by the way, his shirt is clippy.
Yeah. Everybody remember this?
And the text on it says...
It's getting to the point where we have young enough developers that they don't remember this. So...
Wait, does that mean we're old enough that we do remember?
That does, Scott. Oh. That does mean that.
So the text over there is, can I help you with that? And that's our goal for today. Oh, one other thing. If you're in SQL Server Query Analyzer or some of the other Microsoft tools that are working on the Visual Studio shell, a lot of these tips and tricks, particularly the keyboard shortcuts, will work in those environments. Obviously, when we talk about debugging or something specialized to the code, that's not going to work, but there is a lot of crossover between some of the other environments. So Dustin's going to get started with our first set of demos.
All right. So the first set, we're going to kind of group these into kind of basic areas of tips and tricks. And the first thing I want to talk about is IntelliSense. IntelliSense is kind of that bread and butter thing that we all use, sometimes not even realizing we're using it, to help us write code much quicker. So I kind of want to just start off by showing a couple of new things that we did in Visual Studio 2010, and maybe also a couple of things you hadn't noticed that we did in Visual Studio 2010. So first up, we filter the list now. So if I'm typing, we actually filter the IntelliSense list down to what you've already typed. In previous versions of Visual Studio 2008, in C# at least, we didn't do that. In Visual Basic, we did. However, this is a little smarter than you might think initially. It's not just matching against the prefixes of the items in the list. It's also matching against substrings. So if I type something like line, I'll see read line and write line here. Now this is kind of smart in the sense that it breaks up those items in the completion list up into words. So it only matches at the fronts of each word. So if I type like DLI, it's not going to match anything. It won't match read line off of that because it's not a natural word break in the identifier read line. Now, what that also kind of implies, if I've got this kind of word breaking, I can type these even faster. If I just type the capital letters that start each word, like if I wanted to go to read line like this, just capital R and L. That's not as discoverable, but that's also in Visual Studio 2010 to help you use IntelliSense more effectively if you know what you're looking for. All right, so next up in IntelliSense is sort of this, we kind of went after in Visual Studio 2010, in the editor, we sort of went after this kind of consume first style of development. Visual Studio typically hasn't been really good at supporting this. And what I mean by that is when you're using a style of development like test-driven development where you actually use types and members before you actually go off and declare them. You know, IntelliSense is really geared and really optimized for when you declare everything first and then you come down and you dot and you see it in the IntelliSense list and you pick it. But if you're trying to type something that's not there, IntelliSense can kind of stomp all over what you're trying to do. So the canonical example is if I'm doing test-driven development, I have a class called customer tests. Inside there in my test method, I try and create a new customer and the customer hasn't been declared yet, then IntelliSense immediately just types, fills in customer tests because that's what's in scope. So just going to give you an example of what that looks like. Perhaps I wanted to declare a class called wait here, and I press space, and I get the wrong thing. Right? We call that aggressive IntelliSense. There's a little subtle thing here. If I undo, you actually get in the editor what you would have typed had that not happened. Right? So you see that there's a space after that. So like if I typed, dot here to commit IntelliSense, whatever it committed with, you'll see that on undo what you would have typed. However, if you don't want to just be undoing all day, pressing Control Z to undo, you can use Control Alt Space, which switches IntelliSense in Visual Studio 2010 switches IntelliSense from its normal completion mode into what we call suggestion mode, where it doesn't actually stomp all over you. So I can type wait, and you see it's filled in at the top there in IntelliSense. I press Control Alt Space to toggle into this, and when I press space, it doesn't actually commit that. Now, if I'm in suggestion mode and I still want that to happen, I can press Tab to commit to IntelliSense, and I'll get the same behavior. But by typing regular completion characters, you won't be, that won't kind of stomp all over what you're trying to type. Then, along with this, to help support this kind of consume first nature of development, this style, in the new list, there's something that appears in the new list and is pre-selected that doesn't actually exist, right? Now I've said wait W equals new, and in the new list we also put wait in there, even though it's not declared anywhere. We're looking over to the left and we see that you're trying to do something here, and we want to help you out. So that's some of the new IntelliSense features. They're supported in C# and Visual Basic for Visual Studio 2010.
So Control Alt Space is suggest over force.
Yes, exactly.
And do you know if that's persisted in the SEO file?
It is not.
So
it's per Visual Studio session. It does remember between languages. Okay. So if you're working in C# and Visual Basic, you switch. If you like it to be in the suggestion mode, it'll stay in suggestion mode when you switch back and forth.
Okay, great. So we have a question on Twitter with that.
Question from Twitter: do these IntelliSense features work in C++ land?
So the question about IntelliSense and C++ in Visual Studio 2010, no, they don't. That's unfortunately, they had a whole bunch of other things that the C++ team was working on for Visual Studio 2010, and they didn't get these IntelliSense features. They are thinking about those things, and I would ask you to talk to those guys and make sure that they hear your voice loud and clear if you really to get this sort of thing. Because in C++, it can really help, when you're, have all the include files out to the Win32 SDK and all of that. So.
Nice.
Yeah.
No questions at the mic, so I'll jump into a demo about some Windows 7 tricks and Visual Studio tricks kind of combined with starting and navigating. Many of you end up with multiple instances of Visual Studio running at the same time. You have a service over here that you're calling into, and then you also have 50 million other things on your machine. So for the next 3 to 5 minutes, I want to show you how to navigate those using your keyboard, which will dramatically increase the speed of your navigation. So some of this has to do with Windows 7, some of it has to do with Visual Studio, but if you merge the two together, it will tremendously help your speed. So the first thing is the Windows key on your keyboard plays a big role in what we're going to talk about. So you notice the position of icons at the bottom. 1 is Explorer, 2 is Windows, 3 is Notepad. If I do Windows 2, it will instantly launch that application. And that's a nice quick way, and that's just an ordinal position. If I do Windows 3, that will launch Notepad. Watch this. If I do Windows Alt 3, I get the jump list. So the nice thing about that is, again, from the keyboard, you can open another instance of Notepad, and now I have 2 instances of Notepad running side by side. The same thing would be true for any application that's pinned to the bottom. So that we did Windows position, Windows Alt position. The third one I'll throw at you is Windows Shift position. And I do the Shift key in my head, I remember that as Start. So if I do Windows Shift 3, I'll get a new instance of Windows. So now that I have all of these different notepads flying around, which could be instances of Studio, most of you will cycle through them with Alt-Tab. And there's actually a faster way to do that. So Windows T, you notice the little E for Explorer has my focus there. As I right arrow now, I'll see, and from the keyboard I can navigate to those items. So Windows T will focus on the bottom of the pop-ups.
So at that point, you're just using the arrow keys, right?
You could do the arrow keys, or you can do Windows T, which will cycle through them. The last thing I'll show you is Windows B, which will focus your cursor down in your task tray. So then I went to the left and pressed Enter on the calendar. A lot of times I need to see the calendar, but instead of going down with my mouse to do that, I'll just do a Windows B, which focuses on the task tray. So now that you have all these instances of Studio running, you can click through them with the Windows T or Alt-Tab, or you can use the Windows position again. So watch now, if I do Windows 3, it will cycle through. It's like Control-Tab, but it's focused on the application at hand. So in this case, I'm pressing 3. It's only cycling through the notepads. I know that your machine will have 50 different tabs across the bottom and different things open throughout your development life cycle. So now I can do Windows Alt-3, close all windows. You have access to all of that from the keyboard. So the start screen in 2010 has been redefined, and a lot of you have already seen the ability to pin and unpin products. What you might not know is that you can right-click and remove from list. This is helpful if you're a consultant and you're driving from one shop to another. At your second shop, you open up on the projector, and now all your projects are loaded. So in prior versions of Studio, that MRU, or the most recently used list, is something you have to actually edit in the registry. You can also pin this, which means that it will stay forever until you unpin it. And then those also work from the jump list. So you notice that this is my MRU, but if I pin the MVC application, now it's pinned and it will always be there. And so from my navigation, Windows Alt-2, down arrow, enter, will open a new version of Studio showing that particular project. So again, now if I do Windows 2, I can cycle through the different versions of Studio. So there's some quick tips about integration with Windows 7 jump list and the start page of Visual Studio.
One other thing I want to point out on the start page, that close page after project load. I don't know if you're using Visual Studio 2008 or 2005 and you're really irritated that the start page just kind of hangs around. You're like, well, I've started now. I've opened my project and I moved on, right? If you check this box, as soon as you open a project from the start page will close. So that's also new for Visual Studio 2010.
There's another thing, too, that will speed up your Visual Studio when it starts. This shows start page on startup. If you uncheck that at the bottom left-hand corner, that will save you somewhere between 3 and 30 seconds, depending on the status of your machine, because that's going to do some network calls to update your news items. So what a lot of people do is, actually, if we just go into Tools under Projects and Solutions, you can define that Studio will always open your last project. So instead of showing the start page, it'll just open the last solution that you had open. That works great if you're always working in one giant solution. Doesn't work good for a consultant where things are constantly changing.
Yeah. All right. Let's switch back over to mine. I want to show you guys some more stuff in the editor. So I'm going to work with a little bit of VB here because this works really nicely with Visual Basic. But first up, if you bought Visual Studio 2010, so I've heard before, I bought Visual Studio 2010 and all I got was this great zoom feature, right? There are keyboard shortcuts. When I speak of zoom, I'm talking about this little indicator down here where I can make it unbelievably huge, right? Which works great for presentations, but if you're just trying to dial this in and you don't want to grab the mouse and get down there, you can use Control Shift and then the angle brackets keys, the left less than greater than, so you can use the keyboard to also zoom in.
I remember that with the greater than and less than. It's like make my
Yep.
font bigger or make my font smaller.
Yep.
So that works great.
And then another editor feature that's brand new to Visual Studio 2010, well, sort of. We've had box selection for a long time, and that's where you hold the Alt key and drag with the mouse instead of creating what we call a stream selection, where it's actually, it's actually creating a box, lines and columns as your selection in the editor. But in prior versions of Visual Studio, if you started typing, it just replaced all that with what you were typing. Just, on one line, it collapsed the whole thing down. Well, in Visual Studio 2010, we've chosen to, I guess, enhance that so that it allows that when you type, it types on every single line. So let me just demonstrate it. So if I had public fields here, that's a no-no, right? I could just change them all to private, like so. Okay, so that's new in Visual Studio 2010. Hold the Alt key, drag with the mouse, or you can hold the Alt key and use the arrows to create your selection, and that will automatically do that. Now, of course, I might, since this is VB10, I can also just turn this into auto properties. So it's very difficult to see, but what I've done is I've holding the Alt key and I'm dragging it down and I'm creating a zero width selection. So it's really hard to see on the monitor, but I can type right there like that. Okay.
And
so
copy paste works with that break
Yep.
as well, or that block mode as well.
Exactly. Yep. So that's brand new for 2010. Now let me switch over to actually, first I want to take a look at some more VB. So one of the requests we always get is about highlighting references. There are a lot of competitors to Visual Studio that do this, and it just seems so simple. We should just do it, and so we did. So in Visual Studio 2010, if you place your caret on an identifier, it will show all instance of that in the editor. It might be hard. No, it's not that hard to see. You can see that up there. So But what's interesting, what's useful about this is that there are shortcut keys you can use to navigate between these. So if I have a couple of places where I'm using player, I can navigate between them with Control Shift and then the up and down arrow keys. So I can navigate between all the places where this appears in my file. All right. Now in Visual Basic, we took this a little step further. We did a little bit more with it, and we decided to make highlight references also highlight the interesting keywords in Visual Basic blocks, language construct blocks. So like on this while loop, we'll highlight the start and the beginning and end of the while, right? Or on this if, you'll get the if, then, and end if. I find this very useful. So if I'm in a method in Visual Basic and I put my caret here, it's sort of like brace highlighting in C# where you can move between brace highlighting with Control Shift square bracket, open the right square bracket in C#. And I can use highlight references in Visual Basic to pop between the top and the bottom of a method. All right, so I'm going to switch over to C# really quickly, and I want to show a couple of other things that are actually C# only for this release. But let me actually grab this same file here.
When we were putting this together, we really wanted to do VB tricks and C# tricks. So
Yep.
if we're talking about a trick in general, it works everywhere, unless we specifically say it's C# only or VB only.
Right, so I was looking at this, one of these methods, new hand. Actually, what if I'm in this method and I'm just, I want to ask questions about how is this thing used in my application? I want to understand at a higher level how things kind of connect. In Visual Studio 2010, we introduced a feature called call hierarchy for C#. And if I place my caret here, I can either right-click and choose it from the context menu, which is also very helpful in Visual Studio 2010 because we finally show keyboard shortcuts in the context menus, which is, wow, it took us a long time to do that. But now we can put Scott and I out of a job by learning these keyboard shortcuts yourselves. But that's Control K, Control T, one of those keyboard chords where you hold Control key and you press K and T. And that will put that in the call hierarchy window where I can start looking at the calls to and the calls from this and start kind of exploring the call graph and finding out, hey, how does this thing actually get called, right? Now, I can double click these guys in here and it'll take me to the call site. There's a call site right there. But there's another way to do this that's not as well known. I'm going to bring up the code definition window. And this is the code definition window for this talk is only supported in C#. It's also supported in C++, but it's not supported in Visual Basic. So if I bring up the code definition window, this also synchronizes with the call hierarchy window. So I've got them side by side now, and I can start drilling into things. And as I drill in, I actually see those show up on the right side. Now, what you're seeing in some of these, though, what's kind of interesting is that this one is in fact not in my code. Okay, that's metadata to source. Sometimes you'll see this. This is again a C# only thing, but we will try, and if you're trying to look at a reference that's actually not in your source code, but is in some referenced assembly, we'll create a C#-like view of that so you can kind of look at it. And in fact, you can even interact with this guy. So this is the list of T class inside system.collections.generic in the MS Core lib. So this is something that you don't really have the source code to. But if I can actually interact with that thing and make it show up in the editor, the code definition also synchronizes with the editor. So if I start moving around in here in the editor, I'll see the code definition window update as well to match that. So sometimes I'll just work by having the code definition on another monitor. I don't know, how many people are using multiple monitors these days? Yeah.
Nice,
yeah.
Everybody.
So, sticking these kinds of windows on other monitors so you can kind of get kind of a little bit more sense at a higher level of how your code's kind of being put together. And the last thing I want to show in this section is final references. How many people use final references? Yeah, it's Shift F12. If I'm in the state where I want to just kind of find out where something's used throughout my projects, I can press Shift F12. I get a window down here. Let me close the code def window so you can see that more clearly. That show all the places where this is used throughout my project. So it's a great way I can search in a smart language way, as opposed to just doing a plain text search and searching for things with Control F, but actually search for the real. Hey, these symbols are the right ones. These identifiers actually match up with this one in my project.
You can use F8 in that find symbol results to navigate through them as well.
So that's also not very well known. Thank you, Scott. Press F8. I can navigate through this window.
Nice.
Okay, so
that's in your navigation tip. I just stole that from you.
That's fine. That's
so
totally fine.
I'm going to jump over to some outlining demos. And most of you know outlining as code collapse. So if I click the plus sign in line 19, you'll see that it collapses that method. This is just some silly code that I wrote together for a demo I'll be doing in a minute. New in 2010, you can click the gutter, double-click the gutter, and it will close that. It used to be that you had to be right on that plus sign for code collapse. There are also keyboard shortcuts there. Control-MM will collapse, and then Control-MM again will open. So that will basically toggle your code collapse. I see a lot of you are kind of writing down those keyboard shortcuts. One thing I want to let you know is that 99% of them are in the slide deck. We're not jumping into the slide deck because it's kind of confusing to go back and forth, but there's a lot of the keyboard shortcuts that we're talking about in the slide deck. So along with outlining, one of the things that people do with outlining is they use regions. How many of you use regions? How many of you hate regions? The other half. So the problem with the region is it's stored in the solution. It actually gets pushed up into source control. So some people are region crazy. Like they have regions and regions and regions and regions, and if you're doing a code review, they're like, oh, look at the properties. And then the whole document is one line. So you open it, and then you have properties, methods. And then you open properties, and you're like, person properties, my class properties. And there's just regions nested. So one of the solutions to that is we have something called personal regions. Personal regions are stored in your user profile. That's the SUO file that gets stored right next to the SLN file. And you can basically take a block of code and highlight it, and then do a Control-MH for hide. So Control-MH to hide will create a user region that is persisted across Visual Studio, but only for your project. It doesn't get stored into source control. Then Control-MU will unhide. Now, you'll notice that, well, let me just do it again. Control-MH and Control-MU. And that's arbitrary. You could do that inside of a CSS class and just hide a whole bunch of code. So here's some JavaScript. We don't want to see all of this. Just do a Control-MH, and then it all gets broken in. It doesn't have to be a logical code block that collapses. It's any code that you have selected. So there's a little bit with ad hoc outlining. Collapse the definition we did with the Control-MM, and I wanted to in the outlining talk, do a little bit with file navigation. So you should know that this is a machine that's not mine. All the tips and tricks that I'm doing are not pre-set up. This is just a standard instance of Visual Studio Ultimate. So I've gone into Tools Options, and under Environment with the keyboard, there's an option here to File Open Containing Folder, and I'm going to map that to Control-Alt-Shift-O. And the reason is I use this all the time. For whatever reason, I need to get to the file system. If it's an XML file that I want to open in a different XML editor that's not already mapped in Studio, or maybe I want to open something in Notepad, or maybe I want to edit something. I mean, maybe I want to delete a file that's not showing in Solution Explorer. There's always a reason to get to disk. So this is a great trick to File Open Container, Control-Alt-Shift-O. If you don't like mapping keyboard shortcuts, or you're sitting at someone else's computer, you can right-click on a tab and you have Open Containing Folder there. Notice that keyboard shortcut showed up, but that's custom to me. That won't be on your machine until you map it. But watch what happens here. Control-Alt-Shift-O opens Explorer for me. Now here's two more tricks and we'll get back to Dustin. So I'm going to do Alt-D to get to the address bar. And watch this. In fact, I'm going to zoom in here so you can see this. Watch what happens if I type CMD right in Explorer. A lot of times you have to do something from the command prompt. If you type CMD in Explorer, it will open Explorer for you at that point. You guys like it? There's one more thing. Watch this. If I take a file from Explorer and I drag it to your command prompt, it will go to your command prompt fully qualified. So a lot of times you have a little batch file that you've written and you need to pass a parameter of a file to that batch file. Instead of having to type out the fully qualified name, you can drag and drop from Explorer to command. So that doesn't have really anything to do with Studio, but I use that all the time while I'm developing and thought it would be helpful to throw in there.
Cool, man. So I'm going to switch back here. We're going to look at a couple more navigation sorts of things. So you've got a solution full of a bunch of projects. You've got a lot of tabs open in the tab well. You need to be able to get around these things. And sometimes that's a lot of our day, is just finding the stuff that I was working on 5 minutes ago, right? And so the first thing I want to show is just go to definition, right? Most people know go to definition. Show of hands, you use go to definition, F12, right? Okay, so go to definition is kind of one of these bread and butter things where we can press F12 and drill into things. Again, we can even go to the metadata as source. If I went F12 on bool here, that would take me to this metadata as source view. But what most people don't know is that there's actually a stack being created. And this is a C# only thing, but you can navigate through all of the go to definitions places you've gone to recently. That's different from pressing like Control-Shift-, which walks the navigation stack that you see up here. This is all over the place, right? This is every place I've been to. But if I just want to kind of walk back up and down the go to definition stack, I can use Control-Shift-8 to walk backwards through it, and Control-Shift-7 to walk back down it again. Okay, so if you're doing go to definition a lot, you say, oh, I want to go to definition now, and I spend some time there, and I want to go back to the last thing I was looking at, where I was working, I can press Control-Shift-8 to back right out. Okay, so next up is more of a, as I'm trying to browse this huge project, sometimes it's difficult to find the things that I need to find. Maybe it's a file, maybe it's a class, or maybe it's just a method, and I kind of remember the name of it, but I don't know exactly where it's at. So in Visual Studio 2010, Control Comma is your friend. Control Comma is the Navigate To feature that brings up a dialog that has kind of a fuzzy search for searching around your project. So if I'm looking again for that game, search for deal, I'm like, oh yeah, there it is. Okay.
Let me just break in for a second. How many of you use that? You can thank Dustin for that feature because he wrote it.
Yay. So
he also came up with the Control Comma keystroke, by the way. Every time we have dinner together, he's like, I came up with Control Comma.
Yeah, it's like, Scott, come on, man. Give me kudos for Control Comma.
All right, I'll pay for dinner.
So the other thing about this dialog, you can search by just putting multiple words in there, and you can narrow the search further. But you can also use the same sort of camel case, typing the uppercase letters of something, like I did in IntelliSense earlier. So if I want to find deal, new, game like that, I can easily go there as well. Okay, so if you know exactly what you're looking for and you just want to go there quickly, you can do that.
Nice.
Okay, so next up, This is more of a kind of general thing. How many people get lots of documents in your tab well? Like you've got, how many files do you have open? Anybody more than 20 at a time? Yeah. More than 30, 40, 50? Yeah, I could just keep going and somebody's going to be in back. Yeah, I've got like 600 files open at all times, right? And it's impossible to find out where those things are. You can press the Control Tab and start browsing through these things, these active files in Visual Studio, and that helps somewhat. This is actually sorted in kind of a most recently used order. However, so it's you see that like int32 and system collections generic. So it's not alphabetical. So if you've got a lot of files, it's really hard sometimes to figure out where you were at, except for the most recent, like 3 or 4. So what I like to use is this arrow up here. Okay, everybody's seen that arrow now. But it's really irritating to grab the mouse, right? If I give you something, a trick that says go grab the mouse and do that, you're going to hate me because I just added time to your day. There is a keyboard shortcut for getting at that, and it's really easy. It's Control-Alt-Down.
Okay? I love that.
And then I can just type the first letter of what I'm looking for and press Enter and go there. So I can drive it completely with the keyboard.
I use that probably 500 times a day.
Okay, and last one I want to show in this segment for navigation is actually it's a VB-only feature, and most people don't know about it, even VB users don't know about it, because if you start Visual Studio, for the first time you're presented with that, hey, I want general development settings, C# development settings, VB development settings, and whichever you pick there, it decides what scheme of keyboard shortcuts you want. And the Visual Basic keyboard settings are actually kind of geared towards VB6 users. They have a whole bunch of shortcuts that are geared towards the features in VB6. And so not a lot of people pick that, but there are some nuggets in there. There's some commands that are only bound in the VB profile. I actually bind them myself for when I'm working with VB code in the Tools Options keyboard page. The commands are edit.nextMethod and edit.previousMethod. So I bind these to Control up and down in the editor. And so then in Visual Basic, if I happen to be in VB and I'm bouncing around a file, I can press Control down and just move through the members and types in my file. Okay, so that's a VB only tip. All right, so next up, I think it's back to you, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Couple of things with formatting. You know what? I forgot to say something a little bit earlier, just to give you a little bit of context between Dustin and I. So Dustin's a developer on the Visual Studio team, and I'm an independent software vendor. So I'm like you, living and breathing in Visual Studio all day, and Dustin's on the other side of the fence writing those features. And so we've got a good relationship where we've been able to come up with these tips and tricks and kind of make things better.
Yeah.
So I forgot to say that a little bit earlier. It kind of helps give some context to our...
Yeah, it's good too, because every time we do these talks, we've done this now, this is the second time, but the last time and this time, I learned stuff from Scott that I didn't know about Visual Studio.
Right.
And Scott learns things from me. You might not actually learn things from me. You seem to know everything.
No. Give me some credit. So real quick, format document now works in CSS. So you probably have used this in the past. It's Control-KD, which will kind of clean up your code and format the document. But one thing you might not know is that under Tools Options, you can define what those formatting settings are on a per file type. So I've drilled in from text editor to CSS, and under formatting, you have compact rules. Semi-compact is where that brace stays up at the top. This is the same thing true for JavaScript or C#. You can modify this on the file type. But if I go to compact rules and say OK, and do a Control-KD for formatting, it will format everything on a single line. If I go back in and change that to semi-expanded and say OK, you'll see that it, Control-KD, will kind of fix everything up for me. So format document newly works in CSS and JavaScript. It's always worked in your C#, VB, and ASMX files. So I want to jump into another feature under Tools Options that is extremely helpful for me. It's called temporary projects. Temporary projects are something that I want to write for a few minutes and then probably throw them away. How many of you do that with console apps? Almost everybody. The problem with console apps is they will continue to litter your hard drive. So I used to have C:\code/delete/project name where I would put something. So if you do a Control-Shift-N to do a new console app, you have this information at the bottom that asks you for name, location, and solution. And most of you that I've seen actually just rename this something like delete me or temp or something that you know later on you can come back and clean up your hard drive. Well, a little known feature under the Tools menu, under Projects and Solution, is this particular guy right here that says Save New Project when created. And if you have that on, which is on by default when you install Studio, it asks you for a path. If you turn that off, you can actually start a new project without storing it to disk. And what happens is Visual Studio stores it under your temporary files, and as you close Studio, it will go back and clean them up and delete them for you. So now if I do Control-Shift-N on a console app, you'll notice that there's no path information at the bottom of the screen. So if I open that, and well, I don't need to do that. You can kind of get the idea there. So that's something called temporary projects. There are a few gotchas. It doesn't work with projects that need a solution file.
Yep.
For example, it doesn't work if you need two projects, a class library A and a class library B. Now you've gotten too advanced for temporary projects because a solution's involved. And what'll happen when you do that is it will warn you, and it will basically say, hey, this is a temporary project. You need to save this to disk, and at that point, it'll give you a path that you can save that temporary project. So that's a nice feature that will save you from cluttering up your hard drive.
Yeah, that's also not new to Visual Studio. That's been in Visual Studio since 2005. So the vast majority, unless you're on 2003, your poor souls can use that.
2002, InterDev 6.
InterDev 6.
That didn't work back then. How many of you used InterDev 6, just to know? All right, good. So we got a lot of oldies but goodies. Speaking of the new project dialog, there are a lot of new features on here that you may or may not have seen. Prior to Visual Studio 2010, in order to massage this window, you had to install something. So if you remember back in the ASP.NET Ajax days, Ajax was released out of band. That means that 2008 was released, or 2005, and then after that, subsequently, we released the Ajax 2005 ASP.NET stuff. And in order to get a new project, you'd have to actually install an MSI, and then all kinds of magic stuff happened on your machine. And the problem is then it may or may not work on your teammate's machine because they didn't have all the same stuff installed. And so now life is much, much easier. Most of us know this projects window just based on the recently used templates that we are constantly using. New ASP.NET project, new Windows Phone project, new projects that you're working with. But we also have now online templates. And online templates come from a gallery, which basically means it's constantly updating. If you have an open source project that you want to use, or if you want to install a project, maybe something that's from Microsoft but has not yet been integrated to the core part of Studio, you can simply search for a keyword and it'll go online, and then this will actually bring down all of the bits, all of the assemblies. It'll actually install everything that you need to run that project type. So here's a WP7 app for Caliburn Micro, and if I were to install that, it would actually bring all of that stuff local to my machine. So that's a nice way that Studio now is extendable based on online projects. Keyboard shortcuts, Control-E will focus your cursor up here in the search window. That's actually true throughout all of Studio if there's a search window, and the same thing is true with Windows 7. So if you open Control Panel, there's a search up at the top. If you do Control-E, it'll focus your cursor up there to the top.
Yeah.
Good?
All right.
So I think now we have writing code faster.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to show a couple of new things that some of which were not in Visual Studio. Actually, the first one is not going to be in Visual Studio 2010. It's actually in Visual Studio 2008 Service Pack 1. We added some features in there. When they're in Service Packs, they don't get as broadly, kind of shared out. So it's nice to know about them. So if I right-click and choose Organize Usings, okay, I can clean up any of the using directives at the very top of the file that I'm not actually using. So for example, I could sort them. So if I had, and when you sort, it'll always put the system ones on top and then sort them alphabetically below that. Or I can remove and sort and just remove the whole mess of them because I'm not using anything. All right. Now that kind of causes a problem though. What if I wanted to use, String Builder but I no longer have system.txt up there. There's a couple of things I can do with this. First of all, I want to point out that we're actually squiggling that live in the editor. Okay, you don't have to build any longer to see squiggles in C#. Visual Basic's had this, for a long time, but where you have live error squiggles, live semantic error squiggles telling you what's wrong on the fly in the editor. And I can hover over and I can see that indeed the namespace or type or namespace name string builder cannot be found because I just deleted my using directive. Now, you see right here I have a little tickler, right? We call this the tickler, this little underline that appears to either the left or the right of the identifier. That's called a smart tag tickler. Hey, it lets you know that it's there. Okay? If I hover over this guy, I get some options. And the most important one, I think, is using system.txt. Will actually introduce that using for me, if I'm there. Now, what's not as well known is the keyboard shortcut to bring up that smart tag. Partly because in Visual Studio 2008, if you look at the tooltip, it actually shows like Shift-Alt-F11 or something, really like carpal tunnel forming in order to type it. So but the real shortcut that you want to remember, because it's next to Control comma, and that's why I picked that shortcut, but Control dot will bring up the smart tag. So then I can just control it again with the keyboard, and there we go. Now, suppose I didn't want to use the system.txt.string builder. Perhaps I was creating my own class called string builder. A new feature in Visual Studio 2010 is generate from usage, where it will take a look at the usage of my code syntactically and kind of decide, oh, do you want to generate a type for this, or a property, or a field, or a method? And we'll create the boilerplate behind the scenes. So if I generate a class for string builder, now that's there, if I have 12 to it, we see, oh, it's created a class called string builder for me behind the scenes. I'll press Control-Shift-A to go back. Now this is kind of a start in C#. We're starting in Visual Studio 2010. We'd like to do more in the future, this sort of error corrections, where now we're showing you the errors, and we want to make sure that you're able to get to them quick and fix them quickly. So Visual Basic has had this for a while as well, and all of this works there. So for example, if I were to create, let's say I had a property, and we'll call it in Visual Basic here, we'll call it name. And suppose I want to turn this into a read-only property in Visual Basic. I come up here, I put my read-only specifier. And immediately I get a background squiggle telling me that, hey, something's wrong. And I get a smart tag. Now, Visual Basic actually shows previews. It gives me two suggestions. Hey, you should either remove the read-only or you should remove the setter, right? And it gives me previews of what that might look like. So that's something in Visual Basic as well. And in the same keyboard shortcut, Control dot is going to be your friend to bring that up. So Control dot and Control comma are kind of the keyboard shortcuts that I spend a lot of time pressing. Control comma to navigate, Control dot to apply fixes and generate code for me quickly. Okay, and so that's pretty much the writing code. Now, I want to move on though with this and talk about a little bit about code snippets. How many people use code snippets today? Okay, there's a few people using code snippets. A lot of people don't know they're there. But I can show it to you right here in the tooltip in VB. If I just see the property up here. It says at the very bottom, it says tab twice to insert the property snippet. Okay, and if I tab, that first tab actually inserts the item from IntelliSense, and the second tab inserts a code snippet. This has been available since Visual Studio 2005, but now I have fields that I can fill out, and those fields will then update throughout. Okay, so I can come down here, change name. And then those fields in Visual Basic, there's a slightly different behavior between Visual Basic and C#. Visual Basic, if I keep on going, the snippet fields actually don't go away. In C#, they go away as soon as you press enter and they're gone. In Visual Basic, if I start typing, they'll go away again. So if I want to insert a new property, now I have snippet fields down here. But in Visual Basic, those fields aren't actually gone. They're just hidden. So if you're typing along and you go back and you go, you know what, that was actually not the right name for this property, I can come back and I can say show snippet highlighting from the context menu, and I can go back to editing that snippet as long as I've kept the same file open. Okay. Now, also on inserting snippets, there's a couple of ways to do it. There's that double tab from IntelliSense for various snippets, but there's also the insert snippet UI. There's a dialog, kind of a smart tag dialog that appears in the editor if I press Control-KX. And that shows them grouped in folders. Visual Basic kind of went to town on this one back in Visual Studio 2005. They've added tons of these sorts of task-oriented snippets, so I can find things like how to read from like isolated storage and those sorts of things in here, and little code snippets to help me with that. Also in Visual Basic, so the Control-KX works in C#, but also in Visual Basic there's another shortcut for doing that, and it's if I just type question mark in the editor and press tab. I get the insert snippet UI. Okay, so those are a couple things about code snippets. Those can help you write code quicker. Snippets are also extensible. It's on your hard drive under the Visual Studio folder. There's an XML format, and all the snippets that ship with Visual Studio are defined there, and you can edit them, and you can change them, and you can create your own. So that's a little bit on how to write code faster and do some code snippet stuff.
Nice.
Yeah.
So my next set of demos are around changing your life.
Yes. Debugging.
I really think that this part of my demo is going to be the most helpful for you to become a better developer, and it's because it's the debugger. It's one of the strongest features of Visual Studio, and there are some tips and tricks that you can use that will dramatically increase the ability for you to solve a problem faster. And when you're debugging, what you really need to be better at is navigation. You need to understand how to step into a method, step over a method, run to cursor, and so there's some keyboard shortcuts that I want to show you. If I'm doing a code review and I'm watching somebody debug that is not using the keyboard but instead is using the mouse on their toolbar, that drives me nuts. And mostly that happens because the developer has never been introduced to the keyboard shortcuts. Debugging mostly revolves around F9, F10, and F11. If you're not already having those committed to memory, you need to study them and really pay attention to what we go over here in the demos, because it will make you a better developer. And I've added some new things that are good tricks as well. So on the screen, I'm in an ASP.NET MVC3 application. My cursor is on line 14. And I want to run my application and stop on line 13, actually. Most of you would press F9 to set a breakpoint and then press F5 to run. Is that right? Is that your normal mix? Did you know that you can actually run to cursor, which will start the debugger, start your application, and then will pause in Visual Studio for you on that line? So I haven't littered my application with a breakpoint. That's called run to cursor. And run to cursor is Control F10. Now Control F10 continues to work inside your application. So now I've put my cursor on line 16, Control F10 runs to line 16. So you don't have to set a breakpoint to continue to a specific point in your application. Run to cursor is very helpful. You can also change the execution point. This is an aha moment for hundreds of developers when I show them this, because they've never seen it before. If you have to execute line 13 again, I think 99% of developers will stop this application with Shift F5, then press F5 again with a new breakpoint to get there. But there's a little cursor on the left in the gutter, which is this little yellow arrow. That's the execution point. And watch this. Click, drag, and your debugger execution point has just changed. How many of you is that new to? All right, about 75% of you. So that is a huge time saver, particularly if you're doing some complex debugging, because as a debugger, I may have already stepped into 32 things, and I don't want to have to restart my application to get back to that point in time for debugging. So changing the execution point is tremendously helpful.
The keyboard shortcut for that, by the way, is Control-Shift-F10.
Control-Shift F10?
Yeah.
And then I can use my arrow key to go somewhere?
So if you move your caret, you can press Control-Shift-F10.
So let's do Control F10 to run to cursor. Mm-hmm. Now Control-Shift F10. Control-Shift F10 goes up?
Yeah.
Hey,
yeah.
See? We learn something new every day. So Control-Shift F10 is move the execution point to cursor. It's not running any code there. It's just moving it to
just moving around,
another place.
Yep.
Did you look that up, or did you know that?
No, I knew that.
Curses. Wait, I'm going to write that down for next year. Okay, so here's another one that is, I think, a life changer. I would bet that Dustin and I are the only people in the room to know this, the entire room. And I will ask if you know this afterwards, we'll get a T-shirt to you or something. Take a look at the ugliest code in this solution. I just wrote this. They're really actually bad methods. Control down will scroll my canvas, and they're just silly methods that add a value and then return a value. So line 15, is going to do a bunch of stuff. It's going to call 3 methods. It's going to send the value of those methods in as a parameter to another method. You run into code like this all the time. It's not just a method that you're stepping into. There are some properties, there's some fields, there's different things that are happening. What is that saying? Shift Alt F11. Remember, F11 is step into. If you do Shift Alt F11, you get this menu that says, where do you want to step? How deep do you want to go? And in real code, if you're looking at the code that you've written, this is tremendously helpful because now you don't have to F11 step in, Shift F11 step back, F11 step in, Shift F11 step back in order to get to that third state. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? So Shift Alt F11 changes your life, am I right?
Yep. This is in Visual Studio 2008 Service Pack 1.
So if I step into sum 1 or sum 3, which is the deepest point, it then takes my execution point to that cursor. Now I can do an F10, F10, and then I can continue with that item. So Shift Alt F11. I actually just learned that from Dustin when we were putting this deck together, and since then I've used it probably 100 times a day. It's tremendously helpful while you're debugging. So let's do a couple other things. We've got 3 minutes left for debugging. F9 is set a breakpoint. Most of you know that. Let's jump down into some deeper code where I'm actually setting the value of a property. And if I press F9 here because I want to watch the value change, I'm going to have to watch that value every time it's being updated through all of the methods. And maybe I don't actually want to break there, but instead I want to send myself a message. So you can right-click on your breakpoint and then set something called a condition, and you can also set when hit. Most people know condition. Condition is going to be something like current value is greater than 6, or I think we're only going 3. So current value is greater than 2. My breakpoint now will only be hit when current value is greater than 2. And so that's pretty simple, but I think a lot of people know that. When you add a condition inside the breakpoint, you have a plus sign that gets added. Let's do one more, and that is change your breakpoint to a trace point. So if I go back to breakpoint and then add a when hit, instead of actually breaking my execution, what I might choose to do is write a message to myself in the output window. This is very helpful when you're asynchronous coding, because if you set a breakpoint here and your other thread races by, now it's very difficult to keep those things in sync. So you may want to just have some information, not actually break. So there's some silly syntax here. So we can say value is inside a curly bracket, cur value will actually what gets output to the output window. And then down here at the bottom is very important. Continue execution. That changes from a breakpoint to a trace point, and my application actually won't stop there. So now that I've set that, you'll notice that I'm not a circle anymore, I'm a diamond. The diamonds are trace points and the circles are break points. So let's go back and use our new trick here. Actually, let me unzoom. Shift F5. We'll go back to the home controller. Control F10, which is run to cursor. And then I'll just do an F5 to run. And then we'll go back to Studio and look at my output window, which is Control Alt O. And then you'll see the value there is 3, which was written. 1 and 2 didn't get written because of the condition only execute when it's greater than 2, right? So the idea of taking a debug point, it's like in JavaScript when you don't know how to debug JavaScript, you use alerts. And the problem with alerts is if you're inside of a loop of 100, you get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you have to let all of them go. Changing from debug point to trace point can be extremely helpful. So just recapping real quick, and these are all on the slides. Control F10 is execute to cursor. Control Shift F10, which I love, is move execution point up. And then Shift Alt F11 is step into. And those will tremendously increase your debugging skills. Do you have one more?
No, you got to show the data tips, man.
Oh, the data tips. The data
tips are
tips
cool.
persist.
Yeah.
So we're on a breakpoint here. And let's see, Control F10 will run. What am I doing? Shift F5.
I think you already refreshed it.
There we go.
Okay.
So data tips are these little things that pop up. Most of you have seen them inside of Studio. So if you hover over a number, you'll get to see the value of that number. Let me just execute this, and you'll see number now changed from 0 to 4 because my code was executed. If you look at this closely, there's a little pin here. And as you pin this value, it will pin, let me just get a little more real estate. It'll pin to the end of that line number. So let me move my cursor up again, Control-Shift F10, and as I step through this code, you'll see that the value of number, oh, I guess it's only when it's, let's do a current value here. We'll pin that. So I want you to see it when it changes, it actually changes and turns red. So F10, F10, now you have current value of 4. So the idea there is when you hover over something, you get the little IntelliSense values. You've seen those in the past. This is the ability to pin those, and you can actually pin an entire object graph. If that were person, it would have a plus sign next to it, and you could drill into all the properties of first name, last name. So it's not just for simple values like ints. Here's the cool part. Shift F5 will stop my debugging session and bring me back into writing some more code. Take a look over here in the gutter. There's a little blue pin. As you mouse over that, focus over here on the right-hand side of the screen. As you hover over that pin, that value comes back. And the value of the last debug session is persisted for you. So one of the things that's really nice about this is you can pin that data tip, and then you can let your code run. And if you get an exception and your code then dies, when you come back from this, you'll see the last value. So if you're inside of a loop or you're doing something and you have that item pinned, you'll be able to see the value of 86 is what broke your code, or whatever value you were in with that particular loop. These do persist in that the data tips will be there when you open Visual Studio again. However, the values will not be there until you go through one debug session. And the reason for that is the data tip itself is persisting, but the values are stored in memory. So, good.
Yeah,
thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, that's one of my very favorites, because I sometimes get to methods that are just like big, long, gnarly methods that I need to, I'm always looking, at this one value, and I need to always stick it in the watch window whenever I debug it. But with these, I can set up like some context, some debugging context way ahead of time. So whenever I step into that method, I've already got everything set up so that I don't have to waste any time with that. Yeah.
All right, let us hear it.
Yeah.
Lastly, and then we'll close on that, on the debug menu, you can export and import those tips. So you can actually send those data tips to another developer on your team. I will give you some warning. It's pretty finicky. The data tips are stored with a mapping to the variable by file name and line number. So if you're working on a different set of source code, I can't send a data tip to you. But if we're trying to debug the same problem, I can set up the data tips, export them, send them to you. You can import them, and then you can both be on the same team. We have a question from Twitter that kind of relates to that.
Yeah, sort of. It's about can snippets. We were talking about snippets a little bit ago, code snippets. Can they be shared across team? And yeah, they actually can. Here, flip over here. What I didn't show you in this in my demo on code snippets was the code snippet manager. And that's right here on the Tools menu. I can bring this up, and I can see all the languages, what folders it's actually collecting snippets from. So, in fact, in C#, for example, even the refactorings and the generate type, here are all the snippets and where they live that are used to generate that code. And you can edit that. So you can also add and remove folders. You can make these network shares. You can do all this sort of thing. You could take these files, you can put them into source control, and add them here. So yes, these can be shared across teams. You have to kind of do a little bit of setup to do that, but you can.
Nice. Yeah. So the next thing that I have is architectural diagrams. And architectural diagrams are great for exploring code. But there are a few tricks there in that you've probably already seen the demos. You've seen the ORM designer, you've seen the class designer. You can use the diagrams to write code and to add properties to classes and to create interfaces. Most of that is pretty determined. You can also use the architectural diagrams to snoop through other people's codes with something called a dependency graph. And the dependency graph is nice because it will show you all the classes and all the assemblies with little fancy arrows about how everything points to each other. But if you think about the diagrams in that sense only, they're just fancy reports. And they're actually backed by XML, so you can machine code them. And there's probably 1,000-page books just on the diagramming of Visual Studio. May or may not be applicable to you as a developer. One of the things that I use the diagrams for as a developer is something called a layer diagram. So that's what I want to demo for you and just give you whet your appetite slightly to what's available. So when you set up a new layer diagram, it actually sets up a second project in your solution. And the layer diagram lets me enforce rules that cannot otherwise be enforced. So as a developer, one of the first things you learn in .NET is accessibility modifiers. You have public, which is available everywhere across assemblies. You have private, internal protected. There's lots of variations on the scope that's available for your code. However, those are for the compiler. And sometimes your business rules make it so that your code is exposed to places that you don't want it to be. And so with a layer diagram, you can say, here's a chunk of code, A, and here's a chunk of code, B. Both of them have public members, but we only want code A to be able to call into code B, and we vice versa do not want code B to check into code A. So I thought of a very simple example of how this would work. So let's bring up Solution Explorer, Shift-Alt-L. And inside my MVC application, I'm going to drag the account controller, and I'm going to grab the home controller. And then if I right-click on the home controller, I want to add a dependency on the account controller. That means that my home controller is allowed to call one way, but is not allowed to call the other way. So account controller cannot call back in. So let's open up account controller. And right up here at the top, I'm just going to write public static new value, or public static int.
You're inside. Get inside your
Oh,
class.
I'm inside. I need to move in the class. Public static int new value equals 15. So that's not the greatest code. I should probably even name this don't do this. And now inside my home controller, instead of just passing in a number 1 on our value, let's go back to account controller dot don't do this, and now the value of 15 will be there. Control-Shift-B, my code compiles. As a matter of fact, if I do an F5 to run, you'll see that we hit that breakpoint, and my value of don't do this is 15. My code actually runs. It compiles. So let's go back to my layer diagram now and right-click on it and say Validate Architecture. And everything validates because I'm following the rules. From home controller, I'm allowed to call into account controller. Watch this. Let's get rid of that and just change it so that we add a dependency this way, and now validate architecture, and it fails. So let's define failure. My code still compiles. It will execute, but it won't pass the layer diagram. Here's the magic. Inside TFS, you can put a gated check-in that runs layer diagrams. So even though your developer's code will compile, they can't check it in because they've violated your business rules. And the message here is very clear that says invalid dependency. This is what they would get as a message back when they try to check that in. So if you're using TFS, the layer diagrams as a developer further let you enforce your business rules over and above your accessibility modifiers. Good?
Yep.
Layer diagrams?
All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about extending Visual Studio. In Visual Studio 2010, we introduced a lot of components in Visual Studio, like the brand new WPF editor and some things like that make it easier to extend Visual Studio. And then we also added some tools for making community and bringing in extensions much easier. So Tools, Extension Manager, and I can see the extensions that I have installed. I can also go out and grab new extensions. For example, actually, let me show the dark side of the zoom feature. It's kind of the dark, secret, sordid side. So I'm going to zoom in over here, and if I come over here, it's not zoomed anymore, right? It's kind of irritating, especially if you're a presenter and you're like, oh, I forgot to set my font size before my talk. Let me just zoom in, and then you find out it's only for that one file. Well, there's an extension. There's an app for that, right? So I can go to the Extension Manager, and I'm going to look in the online gallery. Now, this is going to populate with everything that's out there that people have uploaded. So, and some of them are at the very top, like the Productivity Power Tools. How many have that installed or using that today? Cool. I'm going to show that in just a sec. But there's one called Presentation Zoom, and it's the one that I find to be just kind of a lifesaver for this. So I'm going to do the horrifying thing to do in a demo live in front of people. I'm going to download, I'm going to install. It's going to say, hey, do you want to restart Visual Studio, which is crazy, right, to restart. I don't have a lot of jokes prepared for this thank goodness it's back. So, so now if I zoom, let me get back here and get zoom in. I zoom in. Now it's on all my files. Okay, so that's a Presentation Zoom extension. That's one of the many, many extensions that are available in the gallery. One other I'd like to show, I know a bunch of you have the Productivity Power Tools installed, but I kind of want to just show a few of these kinds of things that are available if you don't. Because the Productivity Power Tools is a set of extensions that developers and testers and program managers at Microsoft in their spare time were throwing together, cool things that they wanted to put into the product and didn't make it. And so we're able to, out of band, kind of collect those things together into an official kind of offering from Microsoft that adds lots of extensibility features, lots of productivity features into the box. So Visual Studio actually looks a little bit different right now. The tab well looks different. There's coloring on the tabs. The tabs are actually, in fact, they're colored by project. Okay. I now have pinning on the tabs. This is another example of something that's part of the Productivity Power Tools. So I can pin documents over there that I'm working on, and then I can come over here and see the other ones. These are just kind of some of the things, just a couple of the things that are in the Productivity Pack. There's a lot of stuff in there. I would recommend, in fact, that you go tomorrow to the Visual Studio IDE Futures talk, where Wes Hutchins will be showing some of this stuff and how some of it might apply to Visual Studio VNext. One last extension I want to mention that's very popular, and that's the CodeRush Express, which is something that we partnered with to initially just for Visual Basic users, because Visual Basic came in Visual Studio 2005 without refactoring, and so DevExpress produced a refactoring tool that's free. This is full of features and productivity features and is free from DevExpress, so thanks to those guys for doing that, but I just wanted to call out, give a shout out and mention that.
They have a booth here as well if you want to see that. It's a free product.
So, the other thing is sticking right out, and that I keep forgetting to show, but if there's only one reason you want to install the Productivity Power Tools, it's for the add reference dialog replacement. Does anybody feel really strongly about the add reference dialog by default being kind of slow? Any strong believers? Yeah.
Extremely slow?
You hear amens and that sort of thing.
Go to lunch and come back?
So the Productivity Powers replaces the add reference dialog with something that's faster. Right, that's faster. It's easier to use. It's more in line with the new project dialog. It has search up here like the new project dialog and a lot of that. So there's only one thing, the one reason you would install it, it's for that. So that's a bit on extensibility. Also, one last thing I do want to mention, just as a kind of a tip, if you're like a big add-in user and you run into some problems with add-ins, there's a way to start Visual Studio without add-ins. Sometimes you get all these add-ins loaded and now you're stuck. You're like, okay, my Visual Studio is in kind of gridlock. I can't really get into it. If I press Windows R and I bring up the run dialog and I type devenv.exe/safe mode, that actually loads Visual Studio without any add-ins loaded at all. Okay, so if you kind of ever find yourself into that situation, you can do that.
If you have a crash that's happening that's on your machine but not somebody else's machine, this is a nice way to test whether one of those add-ins is giving you problems.
And then one final tip. This is not in the extensibility, but I think we just forgot it. I just saw it on our sheets up here. And that's multi-monitor support in Visual Studio 2010. You know, we've always been able to drag these guys off, the tool windows. We've been able to do that since Visual Studio 2002. In fact, VB, earlier in VB. But this, now in Visual Studio 2010, if you haven't seen this, we can drag off document windows. Okay? So now you can, if you have multiple monitors set up, you can drag those off. Now, as part of the productivity power tools, we extend this even further. So you can create tab wells in these guys. So if I have let me see if I can do this on a single monitor. It might be kind of tough. Let me shrink this down. Here we go. I can actually drag these guys together now, which you can't do in Visual Studio 2010 by itself, but in the productivity power tools you can do that. You can also use the window keys, the Windows arrow keys to move these things around and dock them on the sides and all of that. One thing that's kind of a gotcha with the floating document windows, one of the things we did was that we found that people were expecting that when they double-clicked these things, that they would act like real windows and they would go to full screen. And some of you might remember, or might have noticed that in Visual Studio 2008, if you accidentally dragged a tool window off, you could always get it back by double-clicking it. But you can't now, just by double-clicking it. You can get that behavior back, however, so if I accidentally just did this, and I'm like, ugh, I gotta drag that back on, and if you double-clicked it, that would work. And now it does this, okay? So if you want that old behavior, hold the Control key, and it'll put it back for you. Okay?
That's nice. That's very helpful.
Yep.
So we have time left for some questions if we want to take the mic. We've also got a question on Twitter about the layer diagrams. What was that, Michael?
Question is, can layer diagrams be shared with team members that have Visual Studio Professional to verify dependency?
So the layer diagrams that I showed is a feature of Ultimate. And when I talked in the TFS part, that is something that happens on the server.
Yep.
So somebody at Team System would be able to try to check in code, and they would get that error message. They wouldn't be able to modify the diagram.
So yeah, Professional can't edit, but you can still get the benefits of the gated check. Yeah.
So I see everybody kind of taken off because they're not here for the Q&A, which is great. I'd like to remind you just to please fill out your evaluations for Dev 305. We appreciated it. Thank you. If you have questions, why don't you come on up to the front? Actually, no, there's a lot of people staying, so I said that incorrectly. Go ahead at the mic.
Yeah, just a quick comment. For those that want more on the architectural and the layer, they did a session, full session yesterday on that. There's very excellent information.
Great, and that's recorded, so that'll be available online. Thank you very much. Yes? His mic's not on the left side. I'll come right back to you. Question on the right-hand side of the mic? Oh, did it come on?
Hello?
Yeah.
Yep.
Sometimes when I'm debugging, I want to delete a breakpoint, and it will delete it temporarily, but then when I'm done debugging, the breakpoint's back.
Yeah,
How do I permanently delete those breakpoints while I'm debugging?
I've experienced that as well, and I can't tell you that from memory I know that. I know that the keyboard shortcuts are F9 to get rid of it. Control F9 will disable it. That's where you get the yellow circle, the red circle, but that's hollow. You can see the white through it. And sometimes that persists and sometimes it doesn't. But you know what? I'll get the answer for you.
Yeah.
If you come up and give me your email address, I'll get that to you directly.
I've noticed the same thing as well, and I'm not actually sure why. So yeah, definitely chat with us. Yeah, over on the right.
Let me just go back to that. My hunch might be, and this is just a hunch, that if somehow your solution file is read-only and a developer had checked in those F9s and now you take it off at runtime, I don't know. I'll look up and get a definitive answer for you. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have a blog where you keep on adding these tips and tricks?
Yeah, actually, this is not a Microsoft project. This is something I do on my own. It's scottkate.com/tricks. And here's how it works. I'll just give a 10-second plug on it. So here's a tip 84 search for symbol. If you go into that blog post, it has a real nice Silverlight video player that comes up and just overlays your screen and starts showing you the tip. So there are video posts on scottkate.com/tricks. And there's an RSS feed that you can get for that as well. So thank you. Great question.
Awesome.
I don't have to pay you for that, do I? Good question.
The answer is yes.
Is there a trick to, like in the watch window, to be able to see a non-inheritance view of an object, just a simpler view of properties?
So there is. Let me switch over real quick. there are a couple of things. So the way things are displayed in the watch window is language specific, and each language has what's called an expression evaluator that controls how that's displayed. And in some cases, we actually support a little bit more in either language. So if you're using C#, if I can find this, man, this is hard to find sometimes. But there is a show raw structure of objects in variable windows. Is one of the ways you can tune that. It's not really tunable, but you can show, in fact, this is maybe not what you want. There's more information. VB shows a lot less information, where you don't see everything in the inheritance, but there's not a lot of ways to tune that. Unfortunately, for people that do want to see even more, you can do that. Unfortunately,
sometimes it's handy to see less.
Yep.
I mean, sometimes you have to drill into the inheritance tree in order to get at the property that you're looking for.
Yep.
So it'd be nice to have a toggle there for a simple view, just
Yes.
as a suggestion or enhancement request.
That's good. That's good feedback. Thank you very much.
Great. So that's our session for the recording. We appreciate your time. If you have additional questions, we're here afterwards. Come on up to the front. And thank you guys very much.